A lot of things we could discuss about Cerantonio, but here I just want to take a quick look at one of the problems that started bothering him about the Quran. This is from an article titled, "Why an ISIS Propagandist Abandoned Islam," from The Atlantic. The link is in the description box. We'll pick up the story after Cerantonio's conviction. In prison, he began to study the Quran in greater detail and focused on the aspects that most puzzled him. Among these was the figure called Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, who appears in the Quran's 18th chapter and is believed by many to refer to Alexander the Great. Cerantonio did not see a resemblance between Dhul-Qarnayn and the Alexander of history, but he noted similarities between Dhul-Qarnayn and a heavily fabulized version of Alexander's story written in Aramaic. He considered that the Aramaic version may have plagiarized the Quran, but after acquiring a copy of the Aramaic and translating it for himself, he determined that the reverse was more likely. I always knew that being proficient in Aramaic would one day prove useful. If you ask Muslims today about Dhul-Qarnayn, they'll usually insist that it's not Alexander the Great. They say this because Dhul-Qarnayn, according to the Quran, was a devout Muslim, while Alexander the Great was as pagan as you can possibly be. So, to get around an obvious Quran blunder, Muslims claim that Dhul-Qarnayn is actually someone else, not Alexander. But this response only works if you're not at all familiar with the legends about Alexander that were circulating in the Middle East during the 7th century. Except for the part about being a Muslim, Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran sounds exactly like Alexander the Great in the popular legends of the 7th century, and he doesn't sound like anyone else ever. So when Muslims tell us that Dhul-Qarnayn isn't supposed to be Alexander, they're just denying the obvious. Imagine if Muhammad were delivering revelations today in our time. He comes out and says, "I just received a revelation from Allah. It's a revelation about the man of the red coat. The red-coated one hath a white beard, and lo, he is jolly, and lo, he is a Muslim. He saith unto the elves that maketh the toys, Behold, Christmas is nigh. Finish the toys so I can climb into my sleigh and deliver them to the children around the world. I know if they've been naughty or nice. Bring me Rudolph, ho, ho, ho." Anyone hearing that would immediately think, hey, wait a minute. That's Santa Claus. The story of Santa Claus was originally based on a real person, but now it's just a bunch of silly stories. The real person wasn't a Muslim, he was a Christian bishop. This can't be a revelation from God. But as soon as you point out the mistake, the response from Muhammad's followers would be, no, the revelation isn't about Santa Claus, it's about someone else. Okay, who? Who's it about then? Who else fits that description? Same thing with Dhul-Qarnayn. Realizing that Dhul-Qarnayn was not at all a real person, but was rather based on a fictional account of Alexander the Great, instantly left me with only one possible conclusion. The Quran was not divinely inspired, he wrote. It had taken Alexander the Great fan fiction as fact. Of course, I would have preferred to discover all that 17 years ago and avoided much trouble. He has therefore abandoned not only ISIS, but Islam and religion as a whole. He is an atheist and admires the God Delusion author Richard Dawkins. Notice, because Cerantonio could read the Alexander legends for himself, he knew that modern Muslim responses to the problem were false. Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran is supposed to be Alexander the Great. But not only is Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran a Muslim, when Alexander most certainly wasn't, the stories about Dhul-Qarnayn aren't taken from the actual history of Alexander the Great, they're taken from 7th century fan fiction. Muhammad took popular stories about a popular figure and turned the popular figure into a Muslim for his new religion.
Okay, so we heard the gist of David Wood's argument about Dhul-Qarnayn being Alexander the Great and the Quran supposedly copying off a Aramaic source of the Alexander romance. Now, I'm going to be refuting the claim in that, the specific claims in that video. Well, the issue here is that I'll just go on the record and say that, yes, Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. I did heavy research into this, and I found out that there's no person in history associated with the Gog and Magog story other than Alexander the Great. So there's no way out here Alexander the Great, or Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. Cyrus of Persia, Cyrus of Persia was never, or Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus of Persia was never associated with Gog and Magog. In the Old Testament or whatever. Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. I mean, there's no way out here. But I'll get into how this doesn't prove the Quran is an error in a little bit. Now, the story of Alexander building the wall of Gog and Magog is first found in the writings of Josephus, who's a first century Jewish historian. So the story of Alexander the Great building a wall against Gog and Magog has its origins in the first century from a Jewish historian. The Jewish historian Josephus in the first century states that Alexander the Great adored the name of God and saluted the high priest. So according to Josephus, a Jewish historian, Alexander the Great did respect the God of the Jews. So what this means is that Alexander the Great worshipped the God of the Jews later on in his life, and the Quran is referring to that part of Alexander the Great's life when he became a monotheist, a believer in God, in the God of the Jews. In other words, Alexander the Great did not remain a pagan for his entire life. The Jews believed that Alexander the Great was a believer in God. And for the reference of this, see the Medival Alexander by George Cart, Cambridge University Press, 1956, page 126. So it's very, according to scholarship, the Jews believed, or the Jews believed that Alexander the Great was a believer in the God of the Jews. So it's very possible that Alexander the Great started off as a pagan, and then later he became a believer in God. In the latter part of Alexander's life is what the Quran is talking about. So reading the commentaries on the Quran, reading Tafsir al-Razi and Tafsir al-Jalaluddin, two classical commentaries on the Quran, they identified Dhul-Qarnayn as Alexander the Great. If you read Tafsir al-Razi and Tafsir Jalaluddin on the Quran, chapter 18, verse 83, it clearly says that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. So there's no escape here, right? Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. It's time Muslims admit this, right? So there's pretty much no way out here. But like I said, Alexander the Great didn't remain a pagan. He actually did worship and respected the God of the Jews, according to Josephus and according to scholarship, the scholarly book I just cited. So let's get into this claim that Alexander the Great being Dhul-Qarnayn is not a threat to the validity of the Quran. The Quran does not say that Alexander the Great was a prophet. The Quran just says that Dhul-Qarnayn received revelation or received inspiration from Allah or God, but people receiving revelations from God doesn't necessarily mean that they're prophets. For example, the Virgin Mary, according to the Quran chapter 19 and the Quran chapter 3, got revelations from God or the angel Gabriel, but that doesn't mean she's a prophet or a prophetess, right? So non-prophets can get revelations from God, according to the Quran, but that's a separate claim. Anyways, this claim that the Quran chapter 18 is plagiarized off apocryphal sources, again, is a genetic fallacy. So David Wood is committing a genetic fallacy. What is the fallacy he's committing? He's committing something called the genetic fallacy, attacking the source of the claim instead of the claim itself. The other fallacy he's committing, or the other fallacy that a former ISIS member is committing, and David Wood is committing, since David Wood that's his video, is the post-ergo hoc fallacy, which is a fallacy that says the thing before caused the thing after. So these are fallacious arguments. both the story of the wall of Gog and Magog and the seven sleepers does have a historical core. The seven sleepers of Espus. So the Quran chapter 18 doesn't just mention the story of Alexander the Great; it also mentions the seven sleepers of Espus. So it does have a historical core, as the sayings, as the stories are found in historical writings. Um, so like we know there are theories about where the wall of Alexander is and where the cave of the seven sleepers is. So these aren't fictional stories. There are true stories that do have historical cores in them. So there is historical veracity to these stories found in the Quran. So getting to the Quran copying off the Alexander romance, there's a serious problem with that accusation. Well, first of all, the person in that video, that ISIS member, says that that the Quran copied off an Aramaic story of Alexander the Great. Now, I'm guessing that what he's referring to, what that person is referring to, is the Alexander Romance. The problem is the Alexander Romance was not written in Aramaic, so I don't know what that person's talking about. That's not true that the Alexander Romance was written in Aramaic. The Alexander Romance was written in Greek, Latin, Syriac, I believe. What else was it written in? There was another language, I don't remember, but basically there's no evidence that the Alexander Romance was written in Aramaic. It was written in Greek, Latin, Syriac, etc., etc. Now, the problem with the Quran, the problem with the claim that the Quran copied off the Alexander Romance, is that story that the Quran talks about, the building of the wall of Gog and Alexander building the wall against Gog and Magog, which is what the Quran chapter 18 verse 83 to like 100 is talking about, is not found in the earliest Greek, Syriac, Latin versions of the Alexander Romance, according to scholarship. So, in other words, the Alexander Romance story of Gog and Magog postdates Islam. It came after the Quran was revealed and didn't come before the Quran was revealed. How do I know this? I know this because according to scholarship, that's what the scholarly consensus states. So hang on one second. All right, I was going to pull up the reference, but I can't access it right now. But basically, there's no the first person to talk about Gog and Magog, or Alexander building the wall against Gog and Magog, was Josephus. Josephus was writing in the first century, so there's a historical core to the story of Alexander the Great building a wall against Gog and Magog. It's found in a Jewish historian's work. Hang on, let me see if I can pull up the exact reference for the Alexander Romance postdating the Quran. Just give me 1 second here. Okay, so basically, some modern scholars have argued that the origin of the Quran story may have been found in the Syriac Alexander Romance, but others disagree. 1 second here. Let me see if I can get the exact reference. Basically, there are several versions of the Alexander Romance. There were Syriac versions, Arabic versions, Persian versions, Armenian versions, Ethiopic versions, Greek versions, etc., etc. So notice how there's no Aramaic version of the Alexander Romance, and that's what that guy is saying, that the Quran plagiarized off an Aramaic source, but there is no Aramaic source found in the Alexander Romances. So just give me 1 second here. Let me see if I can. So basically, the Syriac Alexander Romance came in 629 and 630. So this Syriac Alexander the Romance postdates the Quran. It came after the Quran. It didn't come before the Quran, according to scholarship. Okay, here we go. Yep, okay. So how do I know that the Alexander romance postdates the Quran, or the Alexander romance story of Alexander building the wall against Gog and Magog came after the Quran? Because scholarship dictates that the Alexander romance actually postdates the Quran. We read in the book Gog and Magog in early Eastern Christian and Islamic sources, Salam's Quest for Alexander's Wall, page 17. The episode of Alexander's building, and I'll post all my references in the description box below. The episode of Alexander's building a wall against Gog and Magog, however, is not found, is the important part, is not found in the oldest Greek, Latin, Armenian, and Syriac versions of the Romance. Although the Alexander Romance was decisive for building of the new and supernatural image of Alexander the king in East and West, the barrier episode has not its origins in this text. The fusion of the motif of Alexander's barrier with the biblical tradition of the apocalyptic people of Gog and Magog appears, in fact, for the first time in the so-called Syriac Alexander legend. This text is a short appendix attached to the Syriac manuscripts of the Alexander Romance. So according to this book, Gog and Magog in early Eastern Christian and Islamic sources, Salam's Quest for Alexander's Wall, page 17, by Donzel Emir, Shamit, Andrea Barber. According to that book, page 17, the Alexander Romance, the episode of Alexander building a wall against Gog and Magog is not found in the oldest Greek, Latin, Armenian, and Syriac versions of the Romance. In other words, this whole story of Alexander the Great building a wall against Gog and Magog came after the Quran. It came, let's see here, when did it arise? It arose sometime in the 7th century. It arose sometime after the Prophet Muhammad died. According to scholarship. So it was probably, so the Quran was revealed, or the Quranic story was revealed in the late 5th century, and that story of Alexander building the wall against Gog and Magog was formulated in the early 7th century. In other words, it came at least 70 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death that story was put into the Alexander Romance, the Greek or the Syriac version of the Alexander Romance. So the Prophet Muhammad died in 630 or something like that. And this story has its origin in the after the Quran. It has its origin at least 80 years. Yeah, about like 80 years or at least 100 years after that, the Quran chapter 18 was revealed. So my point is that the Quran didn't copy off, the Alexander Romance, because the Alexander Romance did not have that story of Gog and Magog in its earliest forms. And the first version of the Alexander Romance to mention Alexander building the wall against Gog and Magog is the Syriac version of the Alexander Romance, which originated in the late 6th century and the 7th century. In other words, it came at least 80 years, or that version of the story in the Syriac version of the Alexander Romance came at least 80 to 100 years after the Quran chapter 18 was revealed. So it postdates the Quran. It doesn't predate the Quran. So the author of the Quran couldn't have copied off something that came after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So the Quran didn't copy anything from the Alexander Romance. So basically, summarizing my points, Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. Anybody who wants to claim otherwise is just making up history, right? The only person associated with the whole Gog and Magog, the wall against Gog and Magog, was Alexander the Great. So Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great, according to early Muslim scholars themselves, like Tafsir al-Razi, Tafsir Jalaluddin, etc. And I'll be posting all the commentaries of the Quran that state this below. So again, this is not a threat to the validity of the Quran. There is a historical core to that story. It's found in the writings of Josephus. Josephus was a first century Jewish historian, and Christian apologists use Josephus to prove that Jesus existed, because the only place outside the New Testament that mentions Jesus is Josephus. So, so Josephus is a important historian according to Christian apologists themselves, because Josephus is the only first century person to mention Jesus outside the New Testament, or Josephus is the earliest reference to Jesus outside the New Testament. So you see the problem here. You see the problem with people saying that the Quran is copying some fictional story. There is truth to the story of Alexander the Great building the wall against Gog and Magog. There is truth to the claim that Alexander the Great worshipped the God of the Jews, because Josephus mentions it, and some historians do believe that Alexander the Great did later in his life believe in the God of the Jews. So the Quran is not in error here. So the conclusion here is that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, it's very possible that Alexander the Great worshipped the God of the Jews later on in his life. 3, the Quran doesn't copy off the Alexander Romance, because the Alexander Romance came after the Quran. It doesn't predate the Quran. And the whole building of the wall against Gog and Magog was found in the Syriac version, or the earliest story of Alexander the Great building the wall against Gog and Magog in the Alexander Romance, the Syriac Alexander Romance, which postdates the Quran by at least 80 to 70 years. So the Quran didn't copy off any Alexander Romance. Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great did believe in the God of the Jews later on in his life. So the Quran is not in error here, and the Quran didn't plagiarize anything here. So David Wood debunked, and that former ISIS member debunked. Stay tuned, more videos are coming up ahead, and I'll be posting all my references below.